The story happened when I was young, so some of the details might be fuzzy as it was a long time ago. I was in a hotel and happened to be completely alone. Here's some backstory as to why I was alone. Our TV is hooked up to an antenna, so the channels we got were repetitive and boring. It also meant we didn't get the Macy's Day Parade. To solve this issue, we went to a hotel relatively close to us. Unfortunately, my mom came down with a horrible illness a day or two before, so she couldn't join us. We also got our room upgraded to one with a balcony. This is especially important because if the room wasn't upgraded, I don't think this would have ever happened. This happened the day we were checking out, so Thanksgiving Day. Our plan was to hang out the night before, wake up, and then watch the parade in the morning and get home by the evening. It was around 8ish when the rest of my family, not including my mom, went out to run an errand that popped up. I, being lazy and not wanting to get ready just yet, opted to stay in the hotel room. Before he left, my dad said to double lock the door and always check the peephole if ever someone strange should show up. He even did a practice run before he left. In some weird twist of irony, someone started knocking on the door not even 5 minutes after they'd left. Doing what my dad instructed, I checked the peephole. I expected to see my dad, surprising me with another checkup. But the person who I saw looked nothing like my dad. I believe the man was very old, with gray hair, and that showed signs of balding. I specifically remember a small cardboard box he held in his hands. I remember thinking it was some sort of illegal substance, even at my young age. Fear set in as I stood there, unsure of what to do. Then I remembered what my dad had said to do in this situation. The old man called out from behind the door. "Are your parents here?" "No, they're down in the lobby, but we'll be up soon." "Why are they down in the lobby?" At this point I didn't know what to say, so I just backed up away from the door. In hindsight, I'm also sure he knew what my dad had told me. It would turn out this room was right next to ours. I ended up FaceTiming my mom. I had an iPad because I wasn't allowed a phone at the time. She contacted the rest of my family and said to get the hotel staff on the line. I tried calling them, but they didn't pick up. Not wanting to annoy them, I didn't call again. I know that was stupid of me, but I was young and didn't know how to handle this. While this was happening, the man began banging on the door with a new intensity and was yelling for me to let him in. With all the shouting, I couldn't hear my mom, so I went out onto the balcony. However, that spot didn't last. As soon as I went back over to the peephole to see what was going on, there was what I believed to be a security guard trying to help the man get into my room. The weird thing is, the key he was using didn't work for my door, so there's no way it could have been a master key the staff had. Not to mention this hotel doesn't have security, just staff, and I don't remember him wearing a uniform. I walked back out onto the balcony, freaking out. That's when he went into his rear room and began banging on the window, screaming for me to let him in. Terrified, I ran into the bathroom and locked the door, and that's where my dad found me. The man's excuse was that his son and his girlfriend were supposed to be staying in our room. That was blatantly untrue, and probably to save himself. I didn't look old enough to be in a relationship, and he should know that since he saw me. If it wasn't for my dad telling me to check the door, I would have opened it to that stranger. And with that perfect timing of his arrival and his knowledge of a young girl being alone, I have reason to believe he was stalking us. Thankfully, I'll never know that outcome. We never did upgrade our antenna, but luckily live streams became a thing. Alan said he was getting clean again. This time he really meant it. He had already checked into a rehab and was meeting with his counselor twice a week. He told us he loved us. Everything from the moment he trudged through the front door and struggled threading his coat over the lone hanger in the closet suggested it was just one of his tall tales. Tate had made it very clear in the days leading up to Thanksgiving that he was opposed to inviting our older brother. Deep down I knew it was a bad idea too. Whenever Alan came back telling us he was trying to turn his life around, it really meant that he needed us for something. Alan had been the bad egg of the family since our parents died in a car accident while we were boys, and our grandparents stepped up to take us in. He'd been pulling the same bullshit throughout his adolescence with our grandparents too, too old and beaten down to rein him in. So many nights of our teenage years, Tate and I would stay playing Xbox, watch DVDs, only to brace ourselves when we heard footsteps coming up on the porch, and then Alan stumbling in, fucked up and always angry. When our grandparents finally passed, all they left in their estate was the house to pass down to us. It hadn't taken us long for us to grow so sick of the constant parties and Alan's strung out junkie friends passed out on the couch every night that we eventually had to kick him out and try to make it on our own. 1/3 of the share of the decaying 2-story house smack in the middle of St. Paul suburbia wasn't worth much. It was maybe enough to float his drug and escort expenses for a couple of months at the most. Wherever the money had gone, it was clear it had run out by the time that Thanksgiving had rolled around. We'd broken our golden rule and opened up our doors to him one more time. We even tried to take it seriously that year. I'd ordered an organic turkey from a specialty grocer, and Tate had spent hours preparing sides of potatoes, stuffing, broccoli salad, and even made a baked apple pie for dessert. Alan showed his immense appreciation by wobbling in while he struggled to keep his balance in the front hall. His eyes were red around the edges, and he scratched at the left side of his neck like he needed to peel off an outer layer of the skin. His plaid shirt and jeans with some paint stains all around the knees looked like they were on their 10th time being worn without a wash. His eyelids twitched. He looked all over the room like he was having trouble making out the familiar shapes around him. He smiled at us and we feigned smiles back. We were both so nervous. Just how far off the deep end would this night go? Perhaps we'd have to physically force him out if things got out of hand. We made sure the house was dry. We'd even hid the wine and whiskey glasses so he couldn't get inspired. There was a glass pitcher with an ice water smack in the middle of the table, and that's all the three of us would have to drink that night. Want to sit on the couch? Tate gestured toward the living room and then headed back for the kitchen. Dinner's almost ready. Just need to set the table and I'll bring everything out. Alan stared at the dinner table like the idea of sitting down scared him half to death. Nah, bro, I'll stand for now. He kept fidgeting at the front door. He kept looking over his shoulder and out the window. Like even he knew that this whole thing was a bad idea. And he should just make an excuse to jump ship now for all of our sakes. I just gotta get something for my car. Be right back. He slammed the door behind him before either of us had a chance to answer. We looked at one another and shrugged. The whole thing wasn't all too expected, like we were reading from a script. He probably wanted an extra hit of whatever he'd been on all that day, before he could stomach sitting down for a period of longer than 15 minutes. There was nothing we can do about it aside from not let it bother us. So I started setting cutlery and Tate brought the food from the dishes over one by one. The arrangement looked elegant when it was complete. Our late grandmother would have been very proud if she was still around to see it. We gave Alan another 5 minutes before we started eating without him. It wasn't something that needed to be debated. We didn't bother checking on him either, or when he was coming back. The food would only get colder with the more time spent on a wasted cause. We scooped big portions onto our plate and started digging in. Eating with just the two of us didn't hurt that badly. It never does when you prep yourself for the worst case scenario ahead of time. We both loosened our belts and sat there at the table for some time when we were done. Every once in a while, I would glance over my shoulder to the door, waiting for the moment where Alan would burst back in like nothing happened, with some cooked up story about how he got a call from a friend in need, or how he couldn't find whatever the hell he was looking for in his car. Then it hit me. This degenerate didn't even have a car. He never owned one, and hadn't even tried to get his license as best as I could remember. I went for the front window and peered out. The driveway was empty, as I'm sure it had been the entire time. Alan probably had one of his junkie friends drop him off, or walked all the way from whatever ghetto part of town he lived in. He probably took off down the street the moment he realized he wasn't mentally stable enough to sit down for a proper dinner with his brothers. It seemed like all the neighbors were entertaining Thanksgiving guests with their narrow driveways and sprawling city lots stuffed with 3 or 4 cars at least. A single black van was parked on the street directly across from our house. It was one of those 90s GMC Savannas with no windows lining the back. I pictured Alan hunched over inside and desperately taking another hit before he could find the confidence to come back in. The van shook gently, but no door ever opened. I drew the curtain shut, and then my phone started buzzing on the counter, where I'd left it not to distract us from our precious family meal. Sure enough, it was Alan's phone, and the rational part of me was screaming to let it go to voicemail. Then again, maybe I'd find the confidence to tell him how I truly felt over the phone. The cat always seemed to have my tongue whenever I saw him in person. At first, all I heard were gasps on the other end. When Alan's voice finally came through, it was shrill and desperate. Something was wrong. He didn't have the finesse to fake it that well. He stumbled over his words and couldn't find a way to string more than a couple together at one time. It was so predictably infuriating. He managed to fuck himself up swiftly. I didn't want to piss away any more time trying to figure out what was wrong with him. I wish I would have just been jaded enough to hang up the phone right then and there. I glanced back at Tate, who slouched forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees. He stared back at me empathetically. No more interest in the gibberish he could hear from the other line. When Alan was finally able to find his words, he suddenly composed. "Y'all need to come to the reservoir behind the house. Came down here to stretch my legs and slipped. Need some help getting up." "The fuck are you doing back at the reservoir, Alan? You said you were going to your car. There's nothing in the goddamn driveway." "Need to stretch my legs. I'm sorry, brother. I need you to come back up and help me. Messed up my ankle real good. Get your ass up and hobble back up here yourself. We'll pack you a doggy bag and then you can walk your ass home." Suddenly Alan's voice became very stern, threatening even. "Listen, brother. You and Tate walk down here to the reservoir now, or I'm going to call up my junkie friends to go over there and make you. Y'all like that?" I looked up to Tate again. It was clear that he could still hear Alan word for word. He got up from his seat and went to put his jacket on. I stood there speechless. Alan erupted into a burst of shrill laughter on the other end of the line, like he'd gotten the upper hand. He hung up before I could find any more words. "What are we going to do?" While he fished through the front cupboard looking for his glove and hats. "I guess we'll go down to the reservoir." The reservoir was a quarter-mile downhill from the end of our backyard. I'd always felt lucky we had it there. It meant our property was one of the rare spots in the city where we didn't have neighbors towering over our backyard. I fished some old flashlights from under the kitchen sink, and both of us hopped over and headed back. It was surprising Alan would have made it back there on his own. He would have been forced to hop a fence somewhere. I was wondering what condition we'd find him in. Maybe he'd be lying on his back, flailing in the dirt after the adrenaline rush he had on the phone faded. Maybe he'd be sitting calmly on one of those concrete slabs, trying to downplay the whole thing and claim I was overreacting. It was surprisingly dark when we got down there. I suppose we were far enough away from any of the suburb streets to get much illumination. We panned the flashlights all over the empty space. We saw the familiar concrete blocks, with the little weeds poking out in between them, all the way to the sewer opening. Cars whizzed by on the overpass, a couple of blocks to the west. Everything looked as what it should, except Alan was nowhere to be seen. "Fucker," Tate said under his breath. "He's never where he says he is." There wasn't any use in pissing away more time looking for him. We started on our way back towards the house. Wherever Alan was, and however he had made his distress so convincing over the phone, we weren't going to let it be our problem anymore. I was determined to draw the line in the sand from that point and make sure I would never let my older brother or his predictable actions invade my thoughts for the remainder of the evening. That plan lasted maybe 2 minutes. We realized that once again Alan fucked us over before we even made it back inside the house. The rear door had been left swinging open in the cold November air. The whole place had been ravaged. All the dishes had been knocked off the table with the leftovers smeared deliberately all over the floor. Pictures had been pulled off the wall, and all the cupboard drawers had been yanked out and tossed around. Tate dashed to the front door, which had been also left hanging open. Locked it. I ran to the garage to grab 2 baseball bats, which I was thankful hadn't been stolen. We went through the house together, slowly growing more horrified as we realized that everything portable and remotely valuable had been taken. Even our grandmother's gold necklace, which she had passed to her mother and then had passed back to her. Gone. We kept it in a little nook behind the fireplace for the very reason of being stolen. Only Alan or someone who knew us well could have thought to look there. Amid all the contempt I had felt towards my older brother in that moment, I was amazed he had composed himself well enough to divert us so convincingly, and even further impressed that he was so quick to clean us out. We were gone out of the house for 7 or 8 minutes at most. He'd made remarkably quick work of it. I suppose that kind of talent came with time practice. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I'd spent more time tossing and turning than I did lying still. The anger that seeped down to my core and rotted my thoughts from the inside out. For whatever little time I managed to stay asleep, the resentment towards my older brother found its way to wriggle in every corner of my dreams. It was exactly 2 in the morning when I first heard tapping. It didn't feel real at first, more like I was still half stuck in the midst of one of my nightmares. However, the longer it persisted, the more impossible it became to ignore. I was partially grateful for a purpose to get out of bed. I thought maybe the wind was blowing the tops of one of the trees scattered across the backyard against the window. I drew the curtains, thinking nothing of it at first. I saw Alan standing there at the second-story level. I would have thought I was still dreaming had my heart not skipped several beats. The window occupied the upper 2/3 portion of the wall. There was a narrow ledge of the brick lining the outside that you could maybe just get enough of your toes on to support the weight. Even then, it couldn't explain how he'd managed to climb up there in the first place. There was no access point that I could think of. His head was maybe a foot or two above mine. His skin looked sickly white in the pale light from the street, and he looked back at me with dead eyes. The look of a man strung out and barely in touch with the reality around him. The kind of semi-catatonic state you would need to be in to think that climbing up there was a good idea in the first place. I took a step back, and he leaned forward and pressed his cheek against the glass. I tried to scream for Tate, but no sound escaped my mouth. Was my older brother seriously about to break in through the second-story window? Had he tried all entry points on the first floor and was now resorting to checking if I'd overlooked locking one of the windows on the second? His hand stretched to the far right end. It looked like he was trying to wedge his fingers into the crack between the window and the wall. The rage that had been bottled up within me the entire night started to spill out. No social restraint could hold it back right then and there. I started punching the glass and driving my shoulder into it. I tried to create enough force to startle him so he would lose his grip and fall first to the lawn below. "Fuck you, Alan, fuck you!" I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I launched myself harder into the glass. Still, he did not budge. It's almost as if he didn't acknowledge that I was even there. He was so focused on that space between the wall and the edge of the window. The commotion had been enough to wake Tate up. His footsteps pounded from the room over until he was right up next to me, and he looked at me in a state of horror and disbelief. "The asshole's still trying to get in," I said weakly. "What asshole?" Tate asked. I turned back to the window and saw the space was empty. It was the same for the lawn below and all the surrounding areas that we could see. There was no indent on the grass, no scuff marks anywhere that suggest he'd fallen back and managed to scurry away quickly. I didn't press hard trying to explain to Tate what I'd seen out the window, but I managed to convince him to camp out in my room for the remainder of the night. I wouldn't let myself sleep another wink. I was doubtful I could even if I tried. We both sat on the floor of my bedroom with the backs against the wall and our bats in between our legs. I kept staring out the window. Part of me deep down was expecting Alan to try his luck climbing up again. We debated calling the cops at first, but figured it wouldn't get us very far unless we could actually track him down. There was still a part of me worried about Alan's health, even though it vastly was overshadowed by my innate desire to self-protect. If there was any silver lining in all this madness, it was that there was a distinct brotherly bond that had only been strengthened by that night between Tate and I. It all spawned from the disdain from our older brother, just as it always had and always would. It didn't seem like such a long time before the night sky finally started to brighten. The tops of the trees in the backyard started to show their texture, and I could even see back to the reservoir. I might have suggested we bundle up and walk somewhere high enough to where we might be able to catch the sunrise. Maybe we could stop somewhere for an early Black Friday breakfast. We both jumped to our feet, ready and able to fight Alan off if he was going to force another confrontation. Footsteps sounded around the side of the house and then towards the front door. Then, very faintly, a hushed voice whispered something that I couldn't make out. We didn't waste any time. We stormed downstairs with our bats brandished and ready to strike Alan down. There would be no second guessing that time. Everything was remarkably still on the main floor when we arrived. We tiptoed into the front hall, hoping he'd be foolish enough to stay somewhere thinking we hadn't heard him. Right before we reached it, we heard the same voice on the other side. Tate looked at me and nodded. We clutched our bats and unlocked the front door. He tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. He checked the lock again and shook his head. He leaned into it harder the second time, but it still didn't move. I tried pushing him, and it felt like we were pressing against a brick wall. Something was very wrong. Alan wasn't strong enough to hold up the door against us even if he tried. We had been barricaded in. There was absolutely no other explanation. That's when I noticed proof in our surroundings. There was very little of the morning light flooding in downstairs. All the windows, whichever ones weren't already covered by curtains, had been boarded over. No, I said in a panicked voice and moved us through the main floor, looking for any exit that wasn't blocked. Why would this asshole lock us in? Tate looked at me for the first time in years, as I thought he might catch him crying. Did you hear anything during the night? "How could you do that so fast?" he asked. "Come follow me and I'll show you." Alan's voice sounded shrill from top of the stairs, like he'd been waiting for that exact question. We both sprinted to the top of the steps, and sure enough, we saw our sickly-looking older brother staring down at us from atop. He looked so apathetic, like sneaking in our house to torture us was so easily it hardly even amused him. We stormed up towards him. Both of our bats were raised, and there was no doubt in my mind that we would have beaten him within an inch of his life if we had gotten our hands on him. He darted from my room, and we followed, gaining more ground with every step. He had the window wedged all the way open. He hurtled out of it with an incredibly finesse and landed squarely on his feet on the back lawn. He kept running without breaking his stride and hopped the fence like it was nothing. He was already halfway towards the reservoir when Tate and I were still trying to figure out how we would shimmy out ourselves. Neither of us could believe it. We looked at each other and then gingerly slid out towards the window and fell onto our hands and knees on the lawn. We ran as hard as we could after him, thinking that he could have only gotten so far, and wouldn't have anywhere to hide once we had him trapped down in the reservoir. The harsh reality was that we would never see Alan again. We looked back in every nook and cranny and screamed his name like bloody murder into the early morning air, and to no avail. For the second time that night, he had lured us down there only to disappear. I was lost. I was so angry and wanted desperately for Alan to be around so I could take it all out on him. He'd done it. He'd found a way to break us even more than he already had earlier that night. I turned back to our house and screamed his name one more time. "Alan!" It was like my voice had been a timer. I saw the first of the orange flames rising above the roof shortly before I smelled the smoke. I marched back towards the house like I was in a daze. The flames grew higher and higher by the time I reached the back fence. It was like the whole thing had been engulfed in one giant fireball. The house was the last thing he could take from us. And what a show he put on in doing so. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I answered without even looking. Alan laughed wildly on the other line. I fell to my knees and kept listening. The fire had grown taller than the trees. Tate and I spent the next couple of hours at the police station, sitting in a gray room with nothing but 4 chairs, a metal table, and a circular wall clock next to the door. I don't think the cops really ever suspected us of being guilty of starting the fire, but we definitely raised some eyebrows when we gave our rendition of the events that led up to it. The problem was simple. There was physical evidence to contradict the story we gave them, and once they told us what they knew and even showed us evidence pictures, there was nothing more we could say to explain ourselves. Alan couldn't have been responsible for tormenting us that night and then ultimately burning down our house, because he had been murdered shortly after he told us he needed to check on something in his car. The car he was talking about was really that black van I saw parked out on the street in front of our house. It belonged to some drug kingpin who Alan had begged to fall him over, promised him he could get the money from us to pay his debts. The amount owed was in the 6-digit range. That's the only way so many higher-ups would have been involved firsthand. Alan must have had a change of heart when he stepped in and saw us nervous for his visit. He went back out to plead his case, and they dragged him back inside the van and slit his throat right on the spot. The police knew about this for hours before we called to report the fire. They caught the 2 men tasked with dumping Alan's body in a park a couple of blocks over. They already had his body in the morgue, and had 2 criminals in for questioning and selling everyone out well before we were ever on their radar. The dead had been worth more than Alan's life alone. He'd been too big of a problem for them for too long, and they wanted ours as well. At first, they stormed the house expecting to gun us down while we ate unsuspecting at the dining table. Of course, we'd been lured down to the reservoir at that time. They must have just missed us, given the timeline, and decided to rob us of everything we had before coming back for us later on. It took 7 men several hours to board up all the exits in our house quietly in the night, without us hearing. But they were sure they got every exit. Most certainly my bedroom window. There was no way we would have been able to get the boards off from the inside. They torched the house after they heard us yelling and running upstairs, thinking they would sit and listen as the screams turned into burning anguish. Only by some miracle did we head down to the reservoir for the second time when we did. They checked my phone for the call logs from Alan. There was nothing. His phone had been smashed shortly after they'd killed him and tossed onto the street. I could still hear his wild laughter in my head, yet there was no way he could have called. There was no way he could have been at the back window, or back inside of our house. There was no way he was ever actually down at that reservoir. Perhaps he truly did love us. My story takes place in November of 2004. I remember that specifically because George W. Bush had just won his second term as president. I was around 9 years old at the time, and I am 25 years old now. Yet this memory has stayed vividly with me at the forefront of my mind. I can remember it like it was yesterday, and it still makes me so uneasy to talk about. I've never spoken about it to anyone until now. It was a regular school day for me. It was the Friday before Thanksgiving break, and our school gave us our whole week off for it. I was particularly excited for that weekend because my parents were allowing my best friend to stay over for the weekend. It is all I could think about that day. I was a pickup student. This meant that for me to leave the school, a relative or guardian had to be on their records with a signature in order to pick me up from school. I was too anxious to ride the bus, and I was much too anxious to walk home alone, despite living in a friendly small town. That day, my grandma was supposed to pick me up from school. Both my parents were working late, so I was going to go to her house and my mom was going to pick me up there after work. Well, you might be able to tell where this one is going to go. By the time of school was out, my grandma was nowhere to be seen. I waited in the lobby for 30 minutes. By this point, it was empty, besides the janitor mopping up the lobby floor. I was getting nervous my grandma forgot to pick me up, so I went to go tell the office lady that my ride never showed up. I was a nervous kid, and I didn't know what was happening. The lady was really nice. She sat me down in the office and tried calling my grandma. No luck. She tried calling my parents, who said my grandma should have been there already. My mom said she reminded her this morning and would try calling her. She was at work for a few more hours and couldn't come get me yet. It was probably around 4 p.m. at this point. I had been at school an extra hour and I was really scared. I was all alone with the office lady, and I could tell she was frustrated. Everyone had already gone home, and she couldn't get on with her week off because of me. At one point, the janitor walked into the office. It instantly smelled like cigarettes when he walked in. He stared right at me. He was a tall, husky man, long, greasy brown hair with a bit of a screwed-up face and a lopsided nose. That was the first time I'd ever seen this man. I'd never seen him around the school before. Considering the small town I was from, it was weird I didn't recognize him. His presence instantly made me nervous, and I'll never forget what he looked like. He struck up a conversation with the office lady, and I remember this part clearly. He asked her what she was still doing here. She told him and then nodded in my direction. He looked at me intently and then sat down next to me. I can still smell the cigarettes to this day. "Hey kid, bet you're excited about Thanksgiving break. Bet you're excited for some family time." "Me too. Listen, your grandma's place is on the way to my house. I know her, and your grandpa. I'd love to give you a ride over there. I know right where it is," he said to me. He continued, "I know it's scary to feel lost, but I'd love to help you out." And then he smiled at me. I looked over at the office lady. She looked gleeful that she wouldn't have to wait around another hour with me for my mom to get there. She said, "Well, that would be great. My husband is waiting for me to get home now." He stood up and said, "Great." Without my permission, grabbed my hand, pulled me out of my seat and said, "Let's get going then. Your grandma must be worried about you." I shivered. I thought about what he had said. He said he knew my grandpa too. I didn't have a grandpa. He had passed long before I was born, and divorced my grandma many years prior to that. I sat back down and shook my head without saying anything. He looked at me blankly, and the office lady looked disappointed. He ended up walking out without saying anything. 5 p.m. rolled around and my mom finally showed up to get me. Turns out my grandma had forgotten to set an alarm and was sleeping the whole time. When I went to my mom's car, I saw him again in the desolate staff parking lot, smoking a cigarette. He looked in our direction, then got in his truck and drove off. This gives me shivers to this day. He didn't drive towards my grandma's house. He took a left out of the school, which would have taken you out of town towards the city, the complete opposite direction of where he said he was going. I never saw him at school again. I had never seen him before that either. I've cried thinking about this so many times. I remember having nightmares for years where the office lady had made him take me with him so she could go home sooner. And I attribute this to my development of anxiety and paranoia later in life. So, Mr. Janitor, let's not meet again.